In the quiet, upscale suburbs of New Haven, Connecticut, the Westbrook family was well known for their wealth, sophistication, and impeccable reputation. Robert Westbrook, a successful businessman in his early 50s, lived with his wife, Ellen, a devoted homemaker who organized charity events and hosted dinners that were the talk of their social circle. They had a son, Daniel, a sharp 22-year-old who had just graduated college and was set to someday inherit his father's business. The Westbrooks led an enviable life, a beautiful home, luxurious vacations, and a seemingly perfect family, one that carefully concealed the cracks in their unshakable image. However, the balance within this family was soon to be shattered by an unforeseen force. When Daniel returned home that summer, he brought with him his new girlfriend, Grace, a young woman with a lively spirit and a charm that captivated everyone she met. Grace was 20, brimming with energy, and possessed a beauty that seemed to fill the entire Westbrook household with an infectious light. She quickly became a beloved figure in the home. Initially, Robert dismissed his fascination with Grace, reminding himself that she was his son's girlfriend, and he was a happily married man. But as the days melted into weeks, he found himself increasingly drawn to Grace's presence. What started as brief, casual conversations stretched into long, intimate dialogues. Ellen trusted them both implicitly, thinking nothing of leaving them alone. Robert began finding small excuses to be near Grace, suggesting trips to art galleries he frequented or offering to show her the hidden nooks of New Haven he had cherished for years. Grace, captivated by the attention of such a successful and cultured man, responded with an innocent flirtation. At first, their connection was innocent, a lingering look, a light touch. But soon, Grace felt something she hadn't anticipated. Admiration for Robert transformed into something deeper, more dangerous. One evening, Robert invited Grace to join him for a private tour of the Yale Art Gallery. Daniel was out with friends, and Ellen was attending a charity gala. Bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, the museum felt almost enchanted as they walked through its halls. Robert pointed out pieces that held special meaning for him, their voices hushed as they shared quiet moments. As they lingered in front of a painting depicting a classic romantic scene, Robert felt a sudden surge of desire. Without a second thought, he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Grace's face. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world around them faded. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers entwined with his as they surrendered to the pull of the forbidden. A whispered invitation from Grace was all it took. Beneath the museum's soft lights, their lips met, igniting a passion neither had anticipated. Their affair blossomed quickly. When Daniel and Ellen weren't around, they stole secret moments together. Robert found reasons to leave work early, while Grace pretended to have appointments or errands to justify her absences. The thrill and secrecy made each touch, each kiss, electric. They met in secluded spots, a quiet cafe shielded from prying eyes, a hidden corner of the local park, even the candlelit privacy of Robert's office. One day, while Ellen was out of town visiting relatives, Robert invited Grace over under the guise of needing her opinion on some art pieces for their home. As she entered the Westbrook house, her heart raced, the thrill of danger pulsing through her veins. Robert led her upstairs to his private study, where they found themselves alone in the silent grandeur of the luxurious home. Their passion flared wildly as they surrendered to the tension that had built over the weeks. Each encounter became more intoxicating than the last, leaving them both craving more, unable to stop despite the looming consequences. But the thrill came at a price. Robert's demeanor changed toward Ellen. He grew distant, irritable, and more withdrawn. Ellen noticed, but chalked it up to the pressures of his demanding career. Daniel, however, began to suspect something was wrong. He couldn't pinpoint exactly what, but something about his father's interactions with Grace felt unsettling. He noticed shared glances and quiet laughter that felt too familiar. A gnawing sense that something was off began to eat at him. In a desperate bid to confirm his suspicions, Daniel decided to confront Grace late one evening after everyone had retreated to their rooms. Finding her alone in the living room, her gaze fixed on the window, he took a deep breath and sat down beside her, the air heavy with unspoken words. "Grace," he began, struggling to keep his voice steady, "is there something going on between you and my dad?" Grace paled, her eyes widening as she searched for an answer. The guilt she had been suppressing broke free, and she stammered, "Daniel, it's not what." But her voice betrayed her, trembling with shame and fear. It was enough for Daniel to piece the truth together. He left, feeling a mixture of betrayal and rage. That night, a tense confrontation erupted. Daniel demanded that his father admit the truth. Cornered and overwhelmed, Robert initially denied it, but eventually, he broke down and confessed his feelings for Grace. Ellen, who had overheard the exchange, was devastated. She couldn't believe that the man she had loved for so many years could betray her with their son's girlfriend. The family descended into chaos, with pain and anger filling every corner of the house. The following day, Grace attempted to break things off with Robert, realizing the destruction their affair had caused. But Robert wasn't ready to let her go. He felt that Grace had reignited his spirit, given his life meaning again. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her. "I can't just forget you, Grace," he said, his voice tinged with desperation. "This wasn't just an affair for me. You're everything I ever wanted." But Grace, her heart heavy, shook her head. "Robert, we can't go on like this. This is hurting everyone, and I can't live with this guilt. It's over." With a broken heart and fueled by rage, Robert was left in despair. His once vibrant, adventurous spirit was now a shell, haunted by his actions and the knowledge that he had shattered his family. Yet a dark resolve began to take root, a desperate desire to reclaim what he believed he had lost. Robert couldn't let go of Grace. The affair had awakened something within him he hadn't felt in years. To him, Grace was more than a fleeting romance. She was his salvation, his last chance to escape the stifling confines of his life. The thought of losing her to his own son was unbearable. He became obsessed, his mind consumed with thoughts of winning her back, of making her see they belonged together. But Grace had made her choice. The weight of guilt pressed heavily on her, and despite Robert's desperate calls and messages, she decided to cut ties with him. For a while, she avoided the Westbrooks, but before long, Daniel convinced her to return, assuring her that things would settle down. Grace tried to move on, focusing on her relationship with Daniel, hoping to repair the damage done. Meanwhile, Robert's despair spiraled into a dark and dangerous fixation. He parked outside Grace's apartment, watching her window, waiting for a glimpse of her. He sent her letters, begging her to reconsider, each one more desperate than the last. But Grace refused to respond, hoping he would finally understand that their affair was over. This only fueled Robert's obsession. In his twisted mind, he believed she was rejecting him for Daniel, a thought that gnawed at him relentlessly. Tension in the Westbrook household became unbearable. Ellen barely spoke to Robert, her heart broken by his betrayal, while Daniel watched his father closely, suspicious of his every move. The image of a perfect family had crumbled, replaced by an atmosphere thick with bitterness and mistrust. One evening, Robert could no longer contain his fury. After heavy drinking, he drove to Grace's apartment, determined to see her face to face. He pounded on her door, shouting her name, but she refused to let him in. Inside, she pleaded with him to leave, terrified as his voice grew louder and more erratic. Neighbors began to take notice, and eventually, someone called the police. When they arrived, Robert was forced to leave, humiliated and seething with anger. This public rejection, combined with his growing obsession, pushed him over the edge. Robert decided he couldn't simply let Grace go, not after everything they had been through. In his mind, if he couldn't have her, then no one could. This thought crystallized within him, a cold, unyielding determination. In the chilly gray of a Saturday morning, he made his final preparations, knowing that Daniel would be at a work event and Ellen out of town. He drove to Grace's apartment with a somber resolve. The streets were quiet, clouds hung low, casting an eerie stillness over the neighborhood. He waited in his car, watching until he saw Grace step out of her building and walk along the sidewalk. She was alone. Robert followed her, keeping a safe distance until she turned into a nearby park, a secluded spot she often visited to clear her thoughts. He approached her slowly, his hands trembling as he called her name. Grace turned, her expression shifting from surprise to fear when she saw the look in his eyes. "Robert, what are you doing here?" she stammered, glancing around, but no one was nearby. "You didn't answer my calls, Grace. I couldn't just let this end like that." His voice was shaky, a mix of desperation and something darker that sent a chill down her spine. "Robert, please, this isn't healthy. We need to move on," she said, stepping back. But he moved closer, blocking her path. "You don't understand, Grace. I gave everything for you. I risked it all. And now you think you can just walk away." His voice grew louder, anger vibrating through each word. "I'm sorry, Robert," she whispered, her eyes pleading. "But it's over. You have to accept that." This final, absolute rejection shattered something within him. In a sudden, violent motion, he grabbed her arm, pulling her close. Grace struggled, screaming, but he covered her mouth, his grip tightening as his anger turned to brutal force. In his frenzied state, he pulled out a knife he had brought with him, his mind clouded with rage and betrayal. The first thrust was swift, slicing through the cold morning air and into her side. Grace gasped, her body crumpling as blood began to seep through her clothes, but Robert didn't stop. He stabbed her again and again, each strike fueled by a twisted sense of betrayal, a warped belief that this was the only way to make her his forever. When he finally stopped, panting and soaked in her blood, he looked down at what he had done. Grace lay still, her lifeless eyes staring up at him. The weight of his actions settled on him like a suffocating fog, and for the first time, he felt the horror of his monstrous act. The girl he once loved, the girl for whom he had sacrificed everything, lay dead at his feet. Robert stumbled back, frantically trying to wipe the blood from his hands, desperately trying to gather himself. For several days, he fled the scene, leaving Grace's body hidden among the trees in the park. He returned home, his mind haunted by the horror of what he had done. He tried to wash away the blood, to erase it from his clothes and skin, but no matter how hard he scrubbed, the crimson stains seemed to cling to him. The next morning, a jogger discovered Grace's body, and the police were quickly summoned. As the news of Grace's death spread, shockwaves rippled through the community. The Westbrooks were devastated, especially Daniel, who grappled with the horror of losing someone he loved so ruthlessly. It didn't take long for detectives to suspect Robert. Witnesses reported his outburst outside Grace's apartment, and security footage captured his car near the park on the morning of her murder. As the puzzle pieces came together, the police became convinced of Robert's guilt. When confronted, he broke down, his confession spilling out in a torrent of guilt and regret. During the ensuing trial, sordid details of Robert and Grace's affair were laid bare for the world to see. Ellen sat in the courtroom, numb with disbelief, while Daniel struggled to contain his anger and heartbreak. The man they had once loved and trusted was now a stranger, a monster capable of unspeakable acts. The jury found Robert guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Westbrook family was left shattered. The ties that had once bound them together were now irreparably severed. Ellen and Daniel moved away, unable to bear the memories of what had happened. The story of Robert Westbrook's descent from a respected businessman to a cold-blooded killer became a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of the destructive power of obsession and betrayal. The quiet suburb of New Haven would never be the same, haunted by the memory of a family torn apart by a love that was never meant to be. In the wake of Robert's imprisonment, the once prestigious Westbrook family was left in ruins. Ellen and Daniel attempted to rebuild their lives far from the whispers of New Haven, settling in a small town in Maine. Yet the scars left by Robert's betrayal ran deep, and neither of them could escape the shadows of the tragedy. Ellen, once a pillar of her social community, retreated into herself, haunted by images of her husband's monstrous transformation and her own failure to see the warning signs. She could barely look at photographs from the past without feeling the bitter sting of betrayal and shame. Daniel was equally burdened, though his grief took a darker turn. Anger simmered within him, directed not only at his father but at himself for not acting sooner. Despite moving away, he couldn't rid himself of Grace's memory, of the girl he had loved who had been torn from him so senselessly. He took a job in a quiet bookstore, preferring the anonymity of a new place where no one knew his story. Yet even in his attempts to move forward, he found himself drawn to places that reminded him of her: quiet parks, empty cafes, secluded art galleries, as though he were searching for fragments of the life they had lost together. Meanwhile, in prison, Robert's obsession with Grace only deepened. Stripped of his family, his reputation, and his freedom, he clung to memories of her, distorted by his own twisted perceptions. Grace became, in his mind, a symbol of the love and vitality he had longed for, a perfect, unattainable muse whose image tortured him daily. He filled his cell with sketches of her face, obsessively etching out every detail he remembered. To the other inmates and guards, he was a withdrawn, haunted man whose mind seemed trapped somewhere beyond the prison walls. His obsession was both his comfort and his punishment, an endless cycle that kept him awake at night, his thoughts spiraling deeper into madness. For Ellen and Daniel, moving on proved more challenging than simply changing their surroundings. Ellen tried to channel her energy into volunteering at local shelters and charities, hoping to find solace in helping others. But each event, each social gathering, reminded her of the life she'd once had and the illusion of perfection she had clung to. She avoided making new friends, unable to trust anyone, least of all herself. In her private moments, she would wonder if there had been signs she had missed or if she could have prevented the tragedy somehow. Daniel, too, struggled with the trauma in silence. He avoided romantic relationships, haunted by the fear of repeating his father's mistakes. He couldn't shake the gnawing sense of guilt for loving Grace, even after discovering her affair with his father. He told no one about his family or the scandal, keeping his past hidden like a wound that refused to heal. On nights when the memories grew too heavy, he would go to the cliffs overlooking the Maine coastline, listening to the crashing waves and searching the dark horizon for some semblance of peace. The story of the Westbrooks lingered in New Haven's memory, circulating as hushed rumors in the very social circles that had once idolized them. Their old mansion, once a symbol of wealth and prestige, was left abandoned for years, slowly succumbing to the weight of time and neglect. Grass overgrew the once manicured lawns, and vines crept along the stone walls, reclaiming the property as nature took over what had been lost. Neighbors whispered that they sometimes saw shadows in the windows or heard faint whispers when passing by, tales of ghosts in a haunted house that had seen the destruction of a family. Years passed, but the wounds remained fresh for Ellen and Daniel. One winter's day, they received word that Robert had passed away in prison. It was a quiet death. He had been ill, withdrawn, and by the end, he had no one left who cared to remember him. Daniel, now in his late 20s, made the long drive to New Haven to handle the final arrangements, the last responsibility he would ever shoulder for the man who had once been his father. He entered the mansion one last time, finding the rooms empty and echoing, filled only with memories of what had been. Standing in the cold silence of the home that had once held his family, he felt a strange release, as though the final chapter of his father's story had finally closed. After Robert's passing, Ellen and Daniel were finally able to find a small measure of peace. They returned to their lives in Maine, free at last from the shadow of Robert's influence. They spoke little of him or of the tragedy that had nearly destroyed them. Instead, they focused on rebuilding a new life, one where they could define themselves outside of the Westbrook name. Ellen found solace in her work, and Daniel slowly began to open his heart again, trusting that he could forge a future without the weight of his family's past. The tragedy of the Westbrook family, however, remained a ghost story in the quiet suburb of New Haven, a cautionary tale of passion, betrayal, and the dark obsessions that could lurk within even the most perfect of lives. And for Ellen and Daniel, the wounds would fade but never entirely heal, a reminder of a life that had been, and the love that was never meant to be.